Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I should introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth, and this is my colleague, Lauren. Before we begin, Lauren and I would like to thank everyone involved with the Chicago Humanities Festival, especially Julia Meyer, who are so kind to have invited us here today to talk to you about some of the highlights of the Art Institute's collection of the Indian arts of the Americas, which we are both very lucky to be able to work with on a daily basis. Not only does the Art Institute have a wonderful collection of works of art made by the diverse cultures from the vast region of the ancient Americas, many of these works raise very interesting ideas that relate directly to the theme of this year's Chicago Humanities Festival, Animal, What Makes Us Human? And what's interesting is the perspective of the ancient American cultures is very distinct from our own. While many of us in the modern Western world think of human and animal as two separate and distinct categories of being, in contrast, throughout the ancient Americas, there was no rigid boundary between human and animal. Instead, the human world and natural realms were united together in a mutually dependent relationship. We see this presented in ancient American works of art through a combination of human and animal symbols and attributes, which expressed the sacred, supernatural nature of the entire cosmos. Today, we're just going to show you a few examples from the Art Institute's collection that best show this indigenous, traditional American worldview. Now, the Indian Arts of the Americas collection here at the Art Institute, whose galleries we hope you'll visit when we're done this morning, it spans truly the entire Western Hemisphere. And the cultures here date from the time of the rise of the very earliest complex culture, about 2,500 BC, up until today, among many of the modern descendants who maintain many of the traditional beliefs, practices, and ways of life of their ancient ancestors. Now, this map here lists many of the more numerous names of the different independent cultures that arose in the Americas during this vast time period. Each of these different cultures had a distinct worldview which related to the specific local environment in which they each lived. Although there are many differences among these diverse communities, American societies were united through a deeply held perspective concerning how people saw themselves and their role in the larger world. In brief, the natural world was sacred and alive, filled with supernatural beings who controlled the forces of nature. Humans were required to make ritual offerings to honor and nurture these supernatural beings. In return, the supernaturals who controlled the natural world would provide the communities with the sustenance they needed for their very survival. Now, these mutual obligations united the human world and the natural realm in an essential sacred bond. This duality, the joining of opposites, was the very foundation principle that organized the very structure of the societies and the entire cosmos.
Although we will show artwork from several societies, we won't have time today to discuss how all the different Andean societies express this bond between humans and animals in their artwork. So I'll highlight a few that form the backbone of our presentation and are some of the most prominent cultures from the ancient Andean region. As the timeline for this area suggests, the history of this region has its origins at around 2500 BC, and what we're going to look at today spans up until about the Inca times, from 450 to 1532 AD. So it's important to understand that this region was never under the control of a single ruler. Instead, it was a place of ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity, with certain societies emerging at different times, some of which had far-reaching and long-lasting influences. A few that we'll highlight today include Paracas, which is here in the south coast, from approximately 700 BC to about 1 AD, and this society is particularly known for the necropolis and the intricate textiles used to wrap burial remains. And in the next phase of the region, lasting up until about 500 AD, are Nazca on the south coast, which is most famous for their distinctive geometric and animal forms drawn on the surface of the desert, which combined ritual purposes as well as directional markers towards sources of water. And the Mochi, which is a separate culture at approximately the same time as the Nazca, but in the northern coast. And this culture is particularly known for ceramics painted with fine line illustrations of their myths and rituals, and portrait vessels. So none of the Andean cultures have a written language. The iconography we see on their material culture, the same motifs that we will use to explore the union between the animal and human worlds, is the language. So despite differences in culture, geography, and time, this theme remains. So when we show objects from a variety of societies shown on this slide, we are not disregarding their distinct characteristics, but rather emphasizing the commonality of the language of the human-animal dynamic.
The single most important factor in the lives of these numerous and distinct Andean peoples was the natural landscape in which they lived. Now, the region where these civilizations emerge is just a very narrow strip of desert located between the vast Pacific Ocean and the extensive Andes Mountain, which has some of the highest peaks in all the world. Although the great extremes of climate and topography characteristic of the ancient Andes provided a variety of natural resources, particularly with the diversity of flora and fauna, that was essential to sustain large human populations. This was also a land of great environmental insecurity and stress. The Peruvian coast has long struggled through periodic heavy rains and floods of varying intensities and duration, caused by disruptions in patterns of the offshore currents, what we currently refer to as El Niño. In addition, this very thin strip of land, physically trapped between the ocean and the mountains, contains one of the driest deserts in all of the world, with some of these areas never getting any measurable rainfall ever. In this hostile environment, the most central concern of their peoples and the primary responsibility of their Andean rulers and leaders was to ensure that there was adequate food and water to sustain their communities. As we noted briefly at the outset of our talk, throughout the ancient Americas, different cultures believed that the natural world, including mountains, springs, animals, and plants, were alive. These beings had a very direct impact on the lives of the human world. In the Quechua language of the latest Inca, the word used for supernatural things such as this was huacas, which generally refers to any material things that manifested this supernatural, otherworldly nature. It was an energized matter that animated all things with a sacred, special power. These godlike sacred beings throughout the natural world were often personified and portrayed as anthropomorphic beings with specific characteristics, attributes, symbols, and abilities, similar to the gods that we are more familiar with. Most importantly, these supernatural powers of the natural world controlled the wild and domestic plants and animals upon which the human societies depended for their very survival. Because these sacred beings were living entities, they had to be ritually fed, clothed, and tended to as actual physical beings.
Although rituals and sacred ceremonies were conducted by all members of the community, the primary responsibility for maintaining the world largely fell on the shoulders of the rulers, leaders, ritualists, and warriors. rulers and kings were seen to have a special, intimate relationship to the supernatural realm, sharing their otherworldly powers. We see this expressed most directly in their works of art, in which Andean leaders incorporated symbols referring to these sacred beings, particularly imagery related to the most powerful animals in the natural world, into their expressions, public expressions of authority. In addition, the regalia was made with materials such as pelts, wool, and feathers from many of these animals. It's important to realize that by integrating these animal motifs into the clothing and regalia they wore, the objects that they used, and even the temples and palaces where they conducted their public ritual ceremonies, these rulers were not merely referencing the sacred powers that permeated the cosmos, but were understood to be visually expressing that they shared these powers. They were literally transformed, no longer being merely human, but an otherworldly being, giving them special ability to communicate directly with the supernatural realm and for the benefit of the community over which they ruled. So now we're going to look at some of the textiles. This is a 19th century drawing. The harsh landscape, although difficult for sustaining the necessities of the living, is ideal for the preservation of textiles and ceramics. The arid desert environment ensured the preservation of the rich and vibrant colors of these artworks. So the textiles I will show you today are archaeological material that has been interred in the earth for more than 500 years. Although we have remarkably complete textiles, much of what I show you today is fragmentary, or parts of larger pieces such as mantles and tunics. But don't let the early date and the fragmentary state of these textiles deceive you. Andean textiles are some of the finest ever produced. Every single textile displays craftsmanship second to no other culture, past or present. And there are no starter textiles, which means that the established structure for their production must have been in place much longer for which we have surviving textiles. The quality of the materials, which are also rare, and the skills involved in the production of the textiles implies that they had an elevated position in society. They were produced for the highest positions, but also the materials, labor, and expertise must have been valued. Just about every type of textile technique has been found in Andean textiles, including this very large chiquibamba poncho. It's done in tapestry weave, and you can see the detail of fish. This kitty fragment from a border of a Nazca textile in cross-net loop stitching. This Chang headcloth with double-headed cats in gauze weave. These amazing border fragments, again from a Nazca textile, that are done in embroidery stitches. And I just want to call your attention to the intensity of the color of the embroidered yarns and the palette, because this is how they were preserved. And it's an amazingly vibrant and colorful material culture. Creating textiles to shape in this rimac fish, which is would have been appliqué on a larger textile, but shows the weaving to a shape. And of course, feathers in this featherwork tunic. All of these examples are extremely fine textiles with a high level of execution. And this quality and quantity of production requires an organized and skilled workforce, because you need to tend to your animals, get the fleece off of them, and also cotton looms large, so you need to plant, attend, and harvest and process your cotton. Then take that fleece and spin it into yarn, and then we need to create those phenomenal colors. On the left is our cochineal bugs, which are very rare still today, very expensive, and can provide a wide array of colors, 3 of which you can see on the screen at the right. And then weave. And here we have 2 chinchero women organizing the warp for their loom, and then weaving. And I show you these chinchero women as evidence that this is a living tradition. And additionally, we will see on the textiles materials, diverse materials such as feathers from the Amazon on coastal textiles, so you had to have a big trade network as well. So the textiles that we have are mostly garments, like these seen here in this 17th century drawing. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the decorative bands, because that's often what we have left or what remains. And then again, a detail of the drawing I showed before. We also have textiles that were burial offerings. Again, notice that there are decorative sections. They would have been worn or wrapped around the deceased. So whatever iconography found on the textile would also be associated with the wearer or the deceased. They would be used as an identifier not only of who the individual is, but also what that individual's role in society is. The connection would be direct and the message clear. Without a written language, these motifs would be the main form of communication or message from the wearer. And on another level, the distinction between the imagery on the textiles and the wearer would be blurred, and the characteristics of each become a new reality with shared traits. And on these textiles, images of animals feature prominently, and they are representatives of the many facets of the Andean world, including the land, as represented by the spotted monkey, the air and land, and we have cats again and birds representing air, and also these beautiful hummingbirds representing the air. And then for sea, we have this Mochi textile, and just to draw your attention to these pieces, which come over here and represent killer whale. And then there are also animals that represent the movement between worlds, such as this double-headed snake. So as we mentioned earlier, these textiles typically were made for the kings, rulers, and powerful elites. When they wear or are wrapped in these garments, they share the same power. The line between the human and animal worlds is blurred, with the reality being a composite to create something more than its parts. The message is a message of power, power to provide, power to defend, power to rule. But it is not just the end product that determined the message. They were made by members of society that were skilled and revered. It is important to consider the materials, from the wool to the exotic feathers, which literally imbued the textile with their attributes. The materials and the act of making animate and empower the textiles as well. So as a textile conservator, and because of the nature of these textiles, it's impossible to talk about the iconography without focusing on the technical aspects of each piece. So in Andean textiles, the techniques reiterate this idea of duality and support the iconographical intent. So in this Nazca textile, we see a border with birds. And you can see that there are two distinct types of birds shown by the tail feathers. And then we look at the details. We can see that it's really detailed, and each bird has a different animal in its mouth. Here's spider, here's snake, and here's some sort of crawfish. Mary Frame and esteemed Peruvian textile scholars explore the idea that embroidery actually animates these figures, giving them and the wearer these qualities. Each of these motifs has been executed in embroidery stitches, which allows literally stitch by stitch control over the materials and suggests that there is a specific intention for every stitch and every color choice. And the message we see is the idea of abundance, and birds were often used to mark good fishing holes where they dove is where the fish were most populous. And so the idea is that the ideas of abundance, and literally here every bird has a food source in its mouth, so every bird is provided for, and the wearer would be associated with the idea of abundance and being a good provider. From the same culture, we have this headband, and it's red and yellow snake-like images that play off each other in the sense of positive, negative space. And the technique to make this band incorporates the same idea of movement between two disparate, in the case of weaving planes rather than colors. So literally the yellow yarns move to the top and then move to the back as the red yarns come up. So there's the idea of two different worlds, two different planes, positive, negative space, light and dark. The inability to actually identify the specific species on this is not for lack of skill, it's intentional. The maker is trying to draw our attention to other ideas, the ideas of liminal, neither one nor the other, but both and. And the idea of using snake-like motifs is purposeful as well in terms of they are seen to bridge both worlds, and that the combination of the two images would give you that third transformation into another motif. So the connection between the textile technique, intent, and iconography is present in other Andean cultures. So here we have a Paracas tunic displaying the repeated feline figure executed in embroidery. So again, the figure and its attributes are executed with intent and specificity in the embroidery in stitch-by-stitch technique, so that the meaning to the Andean audience would be absolutely clear. So the upright figure has a very specific headdress, very specific earrings, very specific necklace, and streamers with the cat under its arm. And it's also wearing a tunic with some decorative elements around the edges. I won't go into detail here about iconography because Elizabeth will go into that in greater detail. But suffice it to say that the motifs are clear and the message of power and spiritual connection would be indisputable. And again, the technique used to execute these motifs lends itself to strong, specific shapes. The motifs have been worked in what is called block embroidery, where the motifs are built by creating the shapes that determine the image. So literally building up the legs and then embroidering the garment, doing the kitty, et cetera, et cetera. This is also a Paracas textile, and the iconography is perhaps less than clear. Again, are these owls? Are these this other bird known as the goat sucker that has the long prominent beak? We don't know. Owls are connected to ritual beings, and the goat suckers, which inhabit caves and deal with dark, are also known as being related to the moon, to dusk, to kind of the change between day to night. Both the owl and the goat sucker, being flying beings, are able to go between worlds, and so they're known to be liminal beings. And again, here, ambiguity is important. So, and again, the technique on which this textile is made also supports that idea of ambiguity. Instead of building up individual shapes, the red background, or the negative space, was built up first. And then what went back in are the lines of embroidery that would form the shapes. So we have two distinct ways of creating forms depending on what the message that the maker wanted to create. In this Lambayeque textile, we have, I use it to demonstrate that textiles allow for a bigger narrative. You have registers with multiple beings, and you're able to convey a lot of messages at once. So in this fragment, we have birds and plants, which when used together are often identified as a real ritualistic meaning. And the plants often are hallucinogenic, and the birds, of course, go between different realms. And then we also have the camelid here and the pelt, on this idea of the camelid providing both clothing and food. So this could be a harvest or an abundance ritual as well. But I want to draw your attention to details seen in the camelid and the birds to show that these yarns here are made up from using a dyed yarn or naturally colored yarn, the brown yarn in the camelid and the pinker yarn in the bird, combined with an undyed yarn. And the idea that an undyed and a colored yarn would blend together in the spinning to create yet a third color. And this idea of duality, even on this small, small level, would not be lost on an Andean audience. And finally, we look at examples of duality where the imagery actually just becomes really hard to decipher. And this textile, this Nazca Warrior textile, is done in the tapestry technique, which actually gave the maker tremendous control over where threads were put. So again, there is this idea of intent. And I want to focus on this figure right here, because in one direction, we see almost an amphibian shape, head, body, legs, arms figure. But if we look at it the other way, we see possibly human head or composite animal head, eyes, mask, and an elaborate headdress. Again, what is the reality of what we're supposed to understand? probably a composite of the two images to express the complexity. And just because we're working together, there is these two matching bowls in our collection that are also Nazca, and they're matching and they have a repetition of this form on the outside, and it's again this idea of multifaceted, complex, not singular type of being. So we need to work to decipher what's being portrayed in each of these artworks, and then we have to understand what it actually means. But it's important to remember that the visual language is the native tongue of the Andean cultures, and it would have been readable and comprehensible even beyond its locale.
Now I'd like to turn our attention to the second major art form, in addition to the textiles, that we see throughout the ancient Andean region, and that is of the ceramics. Now here I'm just going to show you a few ceramics that are in the Art Institute's collection, and all the pieces that I'm showing are actually, except for one, are currently on view in our galleries, so you'll be able to go and visit in person and see these for yourself. Now here I just show you two examples from two different cultures that Lauren mentioned before. We have two samples of the Nazca ceramics and the Mochi ceramics, and I'm going to be focusing on the ceramics from these two different culture areas. Again, these are two separate cultures, but they occurred at the same time period with the Nazca on the north coast and, the Nazca on the south coast and the Mochi on the north coast, about 180 BC to about 500 AD. Now from this small sample, you can see that the ceramics of the Andes were produced in a variety of different shapes. Typically we see cups, open bowls, tall beakers, and particularly these bottles with these very narrow, tall spouts. Most of these functioned as vessels made to hold different kinds of liquids. Now, because the ancient Andes peoples lived in such an arid environment, they may have been used to hold water, perhaps water taken from a sacred source. Also, if we look to similar vessels being used during the colonial period, Inca, it's likely that these ancient ceramics were used to hold a ritual beverage from fermented maize called chicha, or even a ritual alcoholic beverage made from sugarcane. It's also likely that some of these may have actually been used to hold the blood of sacrificial victims that were taken in battle, as well as animal sacrifices. All of these fluids were sacred and were ritually offered to the gods and supernatural beings to nurture them with the most vital liquids in the world, and also to give thanks for their benevolence. Throughout the ancient Andes, the ceramics display very similar themes, including portraits of their individuals, such as rulers, leaders, and warriors, as well as animals and plants from the natural world and important places in the natural landscape. However, as Lauren has shown you with her sampling of the textiles, the ceramic artists from each of these different culture areas produced their works using very different art styles, making distinct forms and decorating using culturally specific techniques, motifs, and designs. Now on your left, I'm just going to show you two examples of Nazca ceramics. And in this style, you can see the idea is not to create a human form. This actually is a human being. You can see how here's his face, his arms, and then his body. But here, the Nazca artists were not interested in creating portraiture, but the body of the vessel is paramount. And it's decorated using these big areas of flat color that are defined by thick black lines. We see something similar here on one of these bottles. Again, Nazca had big areas of straight color defined by individual black lines. Although these Nazca painters painted in a very sort of generic and straightforward way, we can tell a lot about what the meaning of the imagery was based upon what the people are wearing and what actions they are taking place. Now on the right, I show you similar pieces here from the Mochi ceramics, where from the Nazca, again, we're looking at a very generic shape and very basic painting technique. Here, among the Mochi, we see the use of three-dimensional ceramic form and an increased attention towards actual portraiture. Many of the Mochi ceramics resemble individuals so much that you believe that you could actually recognize that ancient ruler if you got to see him in person. And again, a second style that we see among the Mochi are these fine line drawings. Again, instead of polychrome, it typically is this brown pigment, fine line drawing over the surface of the vessel. And this allowed the Mochi artists to create very long, complicated narratives that reveal to us ideas about their mythology and their history. It's important to remember that despite the remarkable differences in appearances and technique, these ceramics would have been made and used by the most important peoples in each culture, particularly rulers, warriors, leaders, and ritualists. Because of this, these works often display the sources of their power and authority. As expected, these ceramics often show the special relationship that these individuals had with the supernatural powers of the natural and animal worlds. Now, I'd like to begin a discussion here with this Nazca figure. Again, this is a ceramic vessel, and it's one of the larger pieces in our collection. It's about 2 feet tall, maybe 1.5 feet. As I mentioned before, the human figure here is highly abstracted. Here's the face, and then the arms here, and then the body of the individual is actually encompassed in the body of this vessel shape. Now you can see it's a very generalized face, not interested in portraiture. However, this depiction tells us a great deal about who this individual was and what their role and status among his Nazca community was. First, if we look at what he's carrying in his hands, can you see is a series of darts and weapons here and here? In addition, he holds trophy heads. These are the decapitated heads of sacrificial victims, and he's hanging on to them by their hair. What these details tells us is that this individual was a successful warrior who had taken captives during battle and sacrificed them for the gods. In fact, Nazca ceramics frequently depict humans as warriors, indicating the importance of warfare to this culture. Vessels such as this were used to demonstrate that the victorious Nazca warriors would be able to have the ability to kill the enemy in battlefield, remove that enemy's head, and bring it back to his community as a sign of victory. It also demonstrated to the populace that the ruler had the ability to protect and defend their community. Images on other ceramics from this time period make it clear that trophy heads were also used as ritual offerings placed at specific locations throughout the landscape. These were offerings being made to the supernatural beings who controlled the forces of nature. This was done to ensure the agricultural bounty that was essential to the survival of the community. Even today, among the modern descendants of the ancient Peruvian peoples, they make offerings of sacrificed animals and their bloods to the mountains and to the earth, particularly during the rainy season, to ensure the success of their crops. Now, understanding the importance of human and animal sacrifice in ancient Andean societies, warrior vessels such as this not only merely illustrate the individual's success as a warrior, but more importantly, his special ability to provide for the whole community by supplicating the supernaturals who controlled the natural world. Now, this was one of the most important obligations of the Nazca leaders and the leaders from throughout the different cultures of the ancient Americas. Now I want to call your attention to one detail in the costume, the regalia that this individual wears. You can see it has sort of this curled motif and then little fans that are coming out the sides of his cheeks. The importance of this one motif reveals the supernatural source of this warrior's power and ability. So just to reiterate that the motifs that we see in the ceramics also appear in the textiles in different medium, in different scale, and different technique. Here again is that motif on the vessel, and can you see these two warrior figures equally have this motif that covers the lower face. Now I want you to think about what this might be. And one nice little hint as to what this motif represents is given to us by the textile itself. You can see that motif is colored in gold. What I show you here are the vessel, the two textiles, and a gold mask that appears in the Art Institute's collection. Can you see it has that same shape where it has the little chin ruff and then these extended elements off to the side? And actually, this is in the gallery, and it actually would function as a small nose mask or half mask that would cover the face of the leader or the warrior. Now, any guesses as to what you think this mask actually represents and why warriors might wear it? Well, this other vessel from our collection gives us a little hint. This mask actually represents feline whiskers. This bottle is in the Art Institute's collection, and can you see? Here's our kitty. There's his arms, his legs are tucked up here, and his tail curves up the bottle behind him. But again, this mask, human mask, would have been actually representative of kitty whiskers and their chin ruffs. Now, there are many, many different species of felines that were native to South America. The largest of those would have been the jaguar, a skilled hunter of the night. And for the coastal communities that we're looking at today in the dry deserts of the Andes, the jaguar was an exotic foreign animal from the far distant tropical rainforest on the eastern side of the Andes Mountain. Another native South American cat was the puma, who lived among the vast open plateaus and the high peaks of the Andes, and it was noted for its speed, ability to climb, and its agility. Now, we can identify the actual species that this bottle in particular represents. Now, it doesn't have the spots we recognize from the jaguar, nor the cool sleekness that represents the puma. Instead, the distinctive attribute of this feline are the black and white bands that cover his arms, his legs, and his tail. On the left, I show you a representation of a pampas cat, again, one of the native felines from South America. And you can see his distinctive attribute are the lines that appear on his tail and his arm, helping us to identify that this particular bottle represents this specific kind of feline. Now, unlike the jaguar and the puma, pampas cats are not very large animals, and they're not these great fearsome predators. Instead, these smaller felines may have helped protect the agricultural fields of the Nazca by eating the rodents and other critters who would damage their crops. So by wearing the whiskers and the chin ruffs that associate these individuals with the felines, the ancient Andean warriors showed that they shared this feline special ability and attributes, not only as the powers of warriors, as the powers of the most strong predator, but also with the ability to be able to protect the actual agricultural abundance that was so essential. So here we see the message in the costume of regalia is that the warrior is powerful, able to physically protect their community as well as the agricultural fields. Now we see this use of animal symbolism as part of ancient Andean expressions of power and authority, extended even further on this last Nazca vessel that I'm going to be sharing with you today. As with the other early examples I've shown, this vessel shows us a depiction of a composite figure, which again blend both human and animal characteristics. To point out the human, you'll be able to recognize him, I hope. Here's the head of the human being. Here are his arms here. And just like the very first Nazca vessel I showed you, he has a decapitated head in one hand, and on the opposite hand, he has a dart. So here again is an additional representation of a human. He is a Nazca warrior. On the face, you can see he again wears the feline mask. So again, it is our warrior feline, the predator and the protector of the agricultural crops. However, an additional feature of this human transformed into animal is, can you see, this is actually the body of this being. We don't have torso, we don't have legs. We actually have the body of a shark or a killer whale. Again, just like the jaguar and the puma, these two aquatic animals were the most powerful predators in the ocean. Again, an appropriate animal metaphor to use for your warriors and your kings. Now, it's important to keep in mind that what we're seeing here is not just the regalia or a reference to the animal world, but among these ancient cultures, what you wear transforms who you are. So here we're seeing one of these composite beings. It is not a human, it is not an animal, it is supernatural other being. And it's an appropriately proud and strong message for the rulers, able to show that the ultimate source of his power is that from the natural, the supernatural, the other world. Now here we're going to move to the second major ceramic culture I want to talk about today. These will be samples from the Mochi culture. Now again, the Mochi were at the same time period as the Nazca, but they had their own distinct art tradition. Although the style is very different, we're seeing the same ideas represented, particularly this integration, the synthesis of animal and human in expressions of power and authority. Now here's just one example of a beautiful Mochi vessel, and I must say it's my favorite. Now, as I mentioned before, among the Mochi, there is much more interest in three-dimensional form, really more into the portraiture, really capturing the shape of the human body. And you can see the individual here. There's his face. He's actually sitting on what's probably a throne. So this is probably, most likely, one of the independent Mochi rulers. Here you can see he wears a tunic that's covered with these small, probably gold square plates. This is actually a tunic worn by warriors. So here is your warrior king represented once again. Now, what's particularly appealing about this is you can see sitting with him on the throne of authority is a little feline. And again, can you see the banding that's on his legs and his arms? This is the pampas cat. So here, on the throne of authority, sitting directly with the king, is the feline, the protector of the agricultural fields. Not only does this little wild cat share the throne with the Mochi ruler, with this lovely, soft gesture where the king gently rests his hand, perhaps scratching between the ears of this animal. It shows this real essential affinity between the human being and the feline. Now here's just another example we have of one of these three-dimensional Mochi bottles. And again, we're seeing a Mochi Warrior. But first I want to call your attention to how the Mochi showed the synthesis between the animal and the ruler. Can you see the headdress that he wears? At the very top center is the head, and on either side are the big paws of one of these wonderful felines with the claws extending forward. If you look very carefully at the patterning, this patterning relates directly to the pelt of the exotic jaguar, one of these great, wonderful creatures from the other world. Now here what we actually see is the warrior figure getting ready for battle. You can see he carries this very large club in his hand, and he's actually in a position down on one knee as if he's going to raise himself up in order to strike an enemy. During battle, we know that these individuals would engage in hand-to-hand combat, and the idea here is not to kill your enemy in the battlefield, but to knock him out, strip him of his clothes, and then bring him back so he can be sacrificed in front of the full community. Now here we have two representations in bottle form of captives. Here you can see a captive, clearly a captive because all of his clothes has been stripped off, which was the ultimate sign of humiliation. His arms are tied behind his back, and a rope appears around his neck. What's interesting is the idea of the predator, the king, embodying jaguars and supernatural beings, the most powerful predators. We see something similar with the prey. Here, the sacrificial victim, the animal cognate, was the deer. And you can see, this isn't a deer. Deers don't sit like this. It is truly a human sacrificial victim transformed into the ultimate prey, that of a deer. Again, the deer has no clothing. He has the rope tied around his neck, and his tongue lags out as a sign of his imminent death. Now we have a lot of details about what actually happens to the captives and how they're sacrificed. This is not from our collection, but it represents something very clear, and that's why I show it to you here. This is the actual bottle with a fine line drawing, and this is just one little detail of the entire narrative. And I'm just going to step up here. You can probably hear me still. Here is the captive that's been taken in battle. You can see he's stripped of his clothes, and he has the rope around his neck. They've actually come back to the center of the community to conduct the final ritual action. And what I want to show you are these two main figures here. We know among the Mochi that what they would do is they slit the throat of the victim and pour the blood in a cup. Here is the cup being exchanged right there. So the cup is literally being passed from this person to this person. Well, we don't know exactly who is the recipient of the cup. He is dressed as a warrior, and he has these brilliant rays coming off of him. It's believed that this is the supreme god, the sun god, who was a warrior, the primary deity of power and authority. So the question is who is this? This individual literally carries the cup, transfers it from hand to hand directly to the god. You can see he has bird wings, long tail feather, and he has a face of a raptor, whether a hawk or an owl. So the person who brings the blood from the human world to the supernatural world is here represented as a bird, one of these liminal beings able to go up far into the sky of the supernatural world. It's been interpreted that this is your king, transformed into a bird with that unique ability to move from the human realm, bringing the offerings direct to the supernatural realm. Now, the arrival and eventual conquest of the Spanish in the 16th century fundamentally transformed many aspects of the indigenous culture, particularly all things related to the leadership structure and the religious beliefs. In spite of the fact that the Spanish invaders actively tried to suppress the indigenous way of life, the connection between the Andean peoples and their natural world was so deeply held and fundamentally essential that vestiges of this belief, this worldview, still remains among several of the traditional communities that are still living and active in the world today. Now, just a few months back, by pure coincidence, the New York Times had this really fabulous feature about this specific ritual called the Blood Festival that is held each year in remote highland towns of the Andean. It occurs the day after Peru celebrates its Independence Day on July 29th. Now, the highlight of the Blood Festival is a battle between condor, who has been captured from the wild, and a bull that takes place in the bull ring. The condor is identified as a god, literally called the sacred bird of the Andes. And this divine bird is seen as a representation of the living indigenous traditional community. Some say that this festival first took place in colonial times as a way for the traditional communities to express their anger at the Spanish. Even today, the primary focus is on the condor, not the bull. Some scholars actually believe, on the contrary, that what we're seeing is that underlying expression of duality, with the bull representing the earth and the condor the sky, the balancing of these two aspects of the world, which recreated the wholeness of nature itself. It's interesting that the mayor who oversees this, in his hat, wears a condor feather and the Peru flag, sort of representing the king as the uniting of these two different forces. Now, recalling ancient rituals, this is a great festival with lots of drinking of chicha and everything. And then we have the condor literally being tied onto the back of the bull in the bull ring while a series of bullfighters come and attack the bull. They don't really care what happens with the bull, but what's important is the bird should not be hurt or killed. Hopefully that the condor survives, reassuring the community that the supernatural beings they rely on will continue to support them and that a good year is in order. If the bird does get injured, it's an omen from the supernatural world that trouble will come. On the final day of the festival, hundreds of people from the community escort the condors to the top of a distant hillside. Again, an offering is made of chicha to the earth and to the sky in thanks for the benevolence in the past. Everyone here gathers, makes a wish, and tells it to the condor. They make wishes for themselves and for the community. It says that the condor becomes the bearer of these wishes to the supernatural realm, just like the rulers who took on the guise of the birds in the ancient past. The condor is freed, and as it flies away to the cheers and the great celebration of the community, he carries and transforms the offerings and the blessings and the prayers of the community to the supernatural world. So we hope that by sharing with you some of the highlights from the Art Institute's collection, we've been able to show you how this ancient tradition understood their relationship between human and animal. In the ancient worldview, animals were essential for their very survival, the bounty of the land, sea, and sky as primary resources that supported the community. This appreciation is reflected in the belief that natural landscape was filled with these supernatural powers that had direct impact on the human lives. However, there was also this understanding that the productivity within the natural world depended on human action, particularly as the supernatural beings needed to be nurtured through prayer, ritual action, and sacred offerings. And the importance of such understanding of the world is indicated by the fact this recurrent theme of uniting the essential bond between the human and the animal. This reoccurs time and time again, particularly in expressions of power and authority. This forms the very foundation of the worldview of the traditional Andean way of life, and it continues to resonate among its modern descendants. It's also important to understand the relationship between the natural world and the traditional society was not only echoed throughout the world, but is present in all the different media, whether textiles or ceramics or gold work. And one of the things we recently did in our galleries is we reinstalled the galleries, and here is just a little selection of that gallery. And one of the things that was important for us in our reinstallation was making sure we had a case in the gallery, in the South American gallery, that could accommodate our largest textiles, because here we recognize that in order to understand these ancient Andean worldview and people, is we needed to show how the motifs that you see represented in the textiles, as well as the techniques used, resonate directly with the ceramics, so that we can better understand the worldview of a culture and a community so very far distant in mindset and space and time for our own world. Now, I just want to welcome everyone here to the Art Institute. Our galleries are open, and we've selected this season a grouping of textiles that speak directly to the theme of animals, some of which that you were able to see in Lauren's talk. So we encourage everyone to go and visit our galleries. They're not too far away, I promise. So thank you very much.